Well, I think they're seen as a threat to the established order because they represent a tradition of genuine democracy. We have these regimes whose legitimation is based on entirely on saying they're a democratic system. Of course, historically, what they represent are institutional structures that were created explicitly to suppress democracy. I mean, the people who wrote the American and French constitutions were quite upfront about that. But now they've relabeled that democracy. Their entire legitimacy as institutions is based on the popular will and the idea of democracy. The one thing that frightens them the most is the prospect of actual democratic institutions emerging, both because they're strikingly effective as a form of opposition and because they completely delegitimate their claims to legitimate authority. This is exactly the reason why they're terrified of democratic movements, because they don't know who the leaders are, they don't know who to co-opt. A threat to whom and what? You mean, to what degree are we a threat to the established order? I think that we're an enormous threat. I think that in some ways the entire apparatus of neoliberalism is a series of preemptive measures trying to ensure that the kind of mass mobilization and mass resistance that we began to see in the 60s and early 70s doesn't happen again. They talk about it explicitly sometimes. They talk about the Vietnam syndrome. In America, we need to change public perception so we can start invading countries again because our hands are tied. I first realized this, I think it was in 2002, right after 9/11, when we had the IMF mobilizations. And it was something of a desultory affair, a few thousand anarchists. We knew we couldn't really shut down the meetings. We went home rather depressed. We were overwhelmed with cops. And later on, I was talking to some people who knew people who had actually been at the IMF meetings, and they were even more depressed than we were. They said it was completely horrible. The police had 5 layers of security. There was no way to really get to the meetings. Most of the meetings were canceled. And I realized that, my God, the IMF, these are some of the most important people on earth. The security forces are willing to shut down an IMF meeting just so that 5,000 or 6,000 anarchists go home feeling depressed. My God, they must think we're really important. That, if we did feel that we could get something done, if more people felt that this kind of movement was not a waste of time, they would be in big trouble. And I don't think it's because we're going to bring the system down so much as they know the system is crumbling. And what they're terrified is that the people will realize it and start organizing alternatives. The only argument they have is that nothing else is possible. Because that sense of despair, in a way, the idea that nothing else would be possible is the last weapon that they have. One of the remarkable things about this present historical moment is they're hardly arguing that capitalism is a good system anymore. What they're saying is it's the only possible system. Almost all the old arguments, well, a rising tide lifts all boats, even the poor will get, lives are improving, that capitalism is an engine of technological development, that capitalism creates democracy. Those arguments have been obviously proved false. The only line that they have now is, nothing else is possible that wouldn't make things even worse. So the only way they can maintain that is to nip any alternative in the bud. This is the only explanation for why they're behaving the way that they are. They're really frightened. Police are essentially a political institution. They were originally created as a mechanism of class control. It was very explicit. They weren't created to fight crime. They were created to deal with the unemployed, to put people into work, to regulate commerce. And gradually they came up with this excuse that it's going to create public order and public peace. But the first couple generations of police, they weren't even saying that. So the institution is a political institution, and its primary aim has always been to prevent class warfare, to prevent mass mobilization and mass organization against the powers that be. Well, 2003 was an interesting moment. It was the year the Iraq War began, and it was a year of mass anti-war mobilizations across the world. And everybody at the time said that global public opinion, and particularly in the form of street protests and mobilizations, were this sort of burgeoning new actor in world history, something we'd never seen before on this scale. It turned out to have been a relatively brief blip right around the time of the invasion, when it it failed to stop the invasion. A lot of that died down. It was appeared with the global justice movement, which had been stumbling a little in the wake of 9/11, which of course was a huge body blow to everybody involved, since it allowed enormous levels of police repression. Was beginning to pick up again, was beginning to find its feet and reformulate its position in the new, much more violent world than we had seen before. And it was in that context where important questions were being asked and debates were being had about, well, what is our role? We're a democratic movement. Are we strictly nonviolent? What is the level of militancy which we consider acceptable? How do we reformulate at a time when the police seem to feel that they can deploy much, much more violent repression against us? And it was in that context that this guy suddenly appears, who turns out to be a cop, trying to convince us to take a violent course. When I read the thing about this guy, Mark Kennedy, we all heard about it at the time, and I knew some climate camp people who immediately told me dramatic stories about it, and I was like, who is this guy? Have I ever seen him before? I know I was pretty sure I'd never dealt with him. And then one day I was looking at my phone and it said Flash. I had this number there, and I was like, wait, that was the name that Mark Kennedy used. Where did that come from? And I still haven't been able to figure it out. I must have met him at some meeting, and he, was sort of aggressively buttonholing everybody, giving out his number. I took it down, but it was only a year later I saw it there. It's very clear that the police mission is political. It has nothing to do with crime. It has nothing to do with violence. It has nothing to do with maintaining order. They are trying to suppress a political movement which threatens the established order using whatever means they think they can get away with. The most effective means to do that is to try to radicalize people, to make them commit crimes they might not otherwise have considered committing, to try to take nonviolent activists to convince them to be violent, for example, which they do regularly, and then to arrest them for it because you can get long jail terms. So that's the entire point. One thing that's never failed to surprise me is the degree to which the state seems to take us more seriously than we take ourselves. I mean, the degree of resources they're willing to mobilize, the millions of dollars they're willing to spend just to leave, a group of 20 or 30 anarchists feel confused, demoralized, or to undermine us in some way shows that they really feel that we represent a profound threat, the established order. And a lot of the time I just find it almost bizarre, we spend so much of our time sitting around feeling kind of pathetic about ourselves, but clearly the people running the system don't think we're that at all.